With Faruzan's release, we've gained access to a fairly unique support whose primary role is to buff Anemo damage dealers. This is a pretty niche role, but she does it very well, providing some substantial damage buffs to Anemo carries like Xiao and Wanderer. She also makes it a little more viable to build Anemo characters with traditional damage builds as opposed to the EM swirl support builds we typically see on them. The Anemo character that's the subject of this video will be Heizou, who's a little bit more F2P friendly than the other Anemo carries. The team I'm using here puts out a decent amount of single target DPS and can even deal with multiple enemies if her positioning is good enough. But more than anything, I found that this team is just really fun to use and extremely satisfying when you're able to land Heizou's punches consistently. With that said, let's start by taking a look at just the rotation. That was 2 full rotations, and each rotation starts with Bennett's Burst, which has a 15-second cooldown. The first thing you might realize immediately is that the cooldown on Faruzan's Burst is not 15 seconds, it is in fact 20 seconds. Because of that, you might have noticed that I actually skipped Faruzan's Burst on the second rotation. So this is a bit of an unconventional alternating 15-second rotation where there's a little variation on every other rotation. This is a good place to mention that I did experiment with a 20-second rotation, waiting for Faruzan's Burst on every rotation. But this also means that we have 5 seconds of additional downtime on Bennett's Burst, Official Oz, and Heizou's abilities. Even though we gain uptime on Faruzan's Burst, because we lose uptime on those other abilities, I found that the 20-second rotation was a little weaker. Aside from the damage, it was also a bit harder to stay alive because we're losing that uptime on Bennett's Burst. Now let's take a closer look at the rotation and break down all the different interactions that are going on here. We open the rotation with Bennett's Burst, followed by his skill. Bennett's Burst of course not only gives our team a substantial attack buff, but also doubles as the source of healing for the team. Next we use Fischl to summon Oz, alternating between her skill and her bursts on every other rotation. Oz is a strong off-field damage dealer and also gives Heizou something to swirl against to help build up declension stacks quickly for his skill. You can replace Fischl with another source of persistent off-field damage as long as their cooldown is at most 15 seconds. This would include Kaya or Rosario's Burst, Xiangling's Guoba, or even an extra Anemo damage dealer such as Kazuha. Next we use Faruzan's skill, followed by a charge shot. It's important to know that her skill alone doesn't generate any energy particles, and it's actually the follow-up charge shot that generates 2 energy particles. When you combine this with the fact that she has a very expensive 80 energy burst, you really can't afford to skip that charge shot in her combo. I've also given her a Favonius bow to generate those extra energy particles, which really helps curb that steep energy requirement. The skill enhanced charge shot also creates a small vacuum, so it's also a really important utility when you need to group multiple enemies. This is probably the most challenging part of the rotation, especially for players who aren't really used to firing off those quick charge shots. Even so, if you use her for just a few days and practice those charge shots, you end up getting used to them faster than you'd expect. Now let's talk about Faruzan's Burst, which is her defining contribution to this team. Her burst does 2 separate things. It debuffs nearby enemies and reduces their Anemo res by 30%, and it also buffs nearby allies by increasing their Anemo damage percent. On top of that, her A4 passive also increases her allies' next instance of Anemo damage by a portion of her own base attack. And finally, if you have her C6, this buff additionally increases her allies' crit damage by 40% when they deal Anemo damage. In short, it is a very powerful burst that can increase your Anemo allies' damage by approximately 50 to 80% depending on her stats and constellations. The reason I used nearby in quotes just a bit ago is because the buffing effect of her burst actually has a very large range. Some players may be intimidated by how the burst moves in that triangular path, but you actually don't need to be that close or even on the field to receive the buff. clarify, the debuffing effect of the burst does have a shorter range, and the pulse actually does have to hit the enemies to apply the debuff. Finally, we bring Heizou, our Nemo carry, onto the field, and he's enjoying the buffs of his Widsith, Bennett's burst, and of course Faruzan's burst. I like to open with his burst because it creates a little vacuum that briefly pulls nearby enemies in, which helps line them up for his skill. We use his hold skill to make sure he gets that extra damage bonus from using it at max stacks. The high scalings on Heizou's burst, and especially his skill, are the focus of this rotation, and together they deal about 60 to 70% of the rotation's total damage. The success of this rotation is largely decided by whether or not you can land these abilities, especially when there's multiple enemies. I also throw out a couple of normal attacks so that we can trigger some swirl reactions and build up 1 or 2 declension stacks for the next rotation. We end the rotation with Bennett's skill to help him get that burst recharged. Bennett is usually used in teams that have a 20-second rotation, so to sustain this 15-second rotation, you may find that you need more ER than what you're used to. Since we used Fischl's skill to summon Oz last time, we use her burst this time instead. We use Faruzan's skill and charge shot, but we skip the burst because it's still on cooldown. Don't be like me in this clip, please do actually use her charge shot on every rotation. It gives her those much needed energy particles, and it at least applies the Anemo res debuff thanks to her A1 passive. I'll mention here that if you skip Faruzan in your second rotation and swap to Heizou immediately after Fischl, you can still get Faruzan's buff onto him. This is because her burst lasts for 12 seconds, the buff that it grants lasts for 4 seconds, and it's able to buff off-field characters. This is the exact frame where her burst from the first rotation is about to expire, which means we have 4 seconds from this point for Heizou to still use that buff. We can see here that Heizou's punch connects and deals that enhanced damage with just 0.2 seconds remaining on the buff. If I hadn't spent any time swapping to Faruzan just now, we can imagine that Heizou would have made it onto the field with a little bit more time. This means that we would put Faruzan after Heizou on the rotations where we skip her burst, adding a bit of complexity to the rotation for the sake of optimization. This is where I want to mention Faruzan C2. Her C2 increases her burst duration from 12 seconds to 18 seconds, which gives us plenty of time to get Heizou on the field to enjoy those buffs. As I mentioned earlier, the main downside of this 15-second rotation is that we aren't able to use Faruzan's burst on every other rotation. Her C2 effectively negates this downside by making the burst last so long that it overflows into the second rotation. By the time we swap to Heizou for the second time, the burst from the previous rotation still has 4 seconds left. And this isn't even accounting for the fact that the buff itself lasts for 4 seconds after the burst has expired. Coming back to the rotation, we again close it out with a few of Heizou's normal attacks and Bennett's skill, going straight into our third rotation with Bennett's burst. I know this was a really long one, so thanks for bearing with me. There are just a lot of mechanics, interactions, and timings that are involved with this rotation that I didn't really want to leave out. I do hope this kind of demystifies Faruzan a little bit. I do think a lot of players might feel like she's a bit clunky or complicated to use at first, but aside from the charge shot that's required for her combo, the rest of her kit is actually quite forgiving and obviously very powerful. The builds will follow shortly after this, and as always, thank you so much for watching.